Hey everyone, Liz here again, and this time I'm gonna read, it's titled A Multi-Layered Analysis of Mulholland Drive. And if you're unfamiliar with Mulholland Drive, it is what a lot of people consider to be director and writer David Lynch's masterpiece. I think that some would argue Eraserhead instead, but that's not what this is about. It's going to give a pretty solid overview of the plot and everything in the first section, so I'm really not going to touch on it because that would become redundant. So suffice it to say, it's, how would you describe it? Kind of a psychological, surrealist type kind of situation. Because I want to say, like a psychological thriller or something, but that's really not what it is. It's probably not that hard to explain, but, here I am, unable to do so. But, the analysis I'm going to read to you, I will have a link in the description, like I always do, but, I'm sorry I'm saying so much. I'm kind of tired today. It's very early in the morning, and I haven't slept yet. But yeah, it's from, straight and to the point, mulhollanddrive.net. And that's with a dash in the middle. That's /analysis or whatever, but that's the website it's from. And the analysis itself was written by a man named Alan Shaw. And I'm not familiar with Mr. Shaw's work outside of this website, but I've read this entire, very extensive analysis, and I have to say I'm very impressed with the guy's writing and with the guy's, analysis skills. Geez, I've seen this movie a few times at this point, and this was the most helpful in terms of helping me to understand exactly what I was seeing. I love David Lynch, but I'm not going to try and sound pretentious and pretend I understand everything the man does in his movies. So I like to go read these things, and I thought I would share this one with you guys. Now, as I was saying, it is very long and very extensive, and the likelihood that I'll get this done in one video is slim to none. So I was thinking I could do it in 2 or 3 different videos, because this is very interesting, at least in my opinion. And there are, I want to say 7 different sections, and the different sections are the basic narrative, the background and motivation, the Diane Selwyn story, symbolism and metaphor, scene-by-scene analysis, and whenever I say scene by scene, I really mean that. Honestly, that one I'll probably do as its own thing. It goes on to have Lynch's 10 clues and the conclusion. So, lots of content here. Without further ado, I'm going to take a sip of this coffee here, and then I'll get started with the reading. Alright. We're going to start with the basic narrative. Overview. Like so many others, I thought the movie Mulholland Drive was an inspired work. The power of it does not... Oh, let me stop right here and just say very openly and plainly, if it wasn't obvious before, if you haven't seen this movie, don't listen to this, because you are, for one, not going to understand any of it, and for 2, you're going to spoil a really incredible movie-going experience for yourself. Sorry to interrupt my reading, I just wanted to get that out there, and I realized I hadn't. To continue, the power of it does not just emanate from its eerie and mysterious atmosphere, its taste for conspiracy and intrigue, and its poignant love story, which ends tragically in betrayal, murder, and suicide. The force of the movie comes across in the way most scenes are able to communicate on many different levels at the same time. This, in effect, challenges you to tease apart the significance of the multiple layers if you are to really understand the message at the subtext of the story. And just as the metaphorical structure at the subtext of the story is difficult to grasp, the context of the story at the surface level is also a complicated and puzzling challenge. As in other works by David Lynch, there are serious plot twists and shuffled timelines that force the viewer to do some work to decide what the chronological sequence of events in the story really was. But this movie doesn't stop there. Even with a reasonable chronological storyline, the logic of the events is still very elusive. The true genius of Mulholland Drive is in the way that it employs an intricate language of symbolism and metaphor that would give even a complex novel a run for its money. Because of how thick and richly textured the movie is, most reviews of it focus on explaining the plot twists and how the characters are interwoven with one another so that they can make sense of the basic storyline. By doing this, the reviews often de-emphasize the need to understand how to decipher the symbols and metaphors that are major driving forces in the movie. However, that approach can be problematic because without a method for interpreting the symbolism, the basic storyline is easy to misread. For instance, two of the major symbols in the movie are the blue key and the blue box. But you cannot totally understand these symbols without understanding why they are blue, since symbolic colors are a major device running through the entire movie. Even blonde, brunette, and redhead hair colors have special significance. And there are scores of other symbols as well. Names, references to other films, artwork, plot devices, special props, ordinary items like telephones, and certain articles of clothing, among other things, are also important to deciphering the context and the subtext. With that said, I think there are many different depths to which you can go in an analysis of this film. In my attempt to be as thorough as possible, I have written an analysis that digs very deep, and in doing so, I have probably gone into more detail than most viewers of the movie would care to attempt. So, like Lynch, I have decided to provide a multi-layered work for those who are interested in better understanding the film. In this review, I will begin by presenting a surface-level contextual interpretation of Mulholland Drive, which I believe is very approachable for the casual viewer. In it, I will make very little mention of Lynch's abstract symbolism and his extensive referencing of other works, and I will not dig into the philosophical subtext of the film. Next, in a more detailed way, I will describe my method of reasoning through the meaning of the symbols in this movie after I describe what I believe is some of the background and motivation for this work. In my view, looking at the background and motivation give important clues concerning how to unlock the symbolism, and this will require that I touch on some relevant historical details. After doing this, I will present what I believe to be the chronological life story of the protagonist, which is obscured and hidden in the complex narration. I will then go over the scenes in the order they are presented in the movie, with a fuller explanation of how I interpret whatever symbolism I believe is involved. And then, after all that, I will address David Lynch's 10 clues to unlocking this thriller. Oh, I guess he does call it a thriller. Finally, my conclusion will attempt to pull together a coherent interpretation of the heart and soul of this masterpiece, explaining why I believe the film can move a viewer so powerfully, even if that viewer does not fully understand the logic of the core narrative. An interpretation of the basic narrative. Mulholland Drive is a story about a woman named Diane Selwyn who is experiencing an extreme mental and emotional breakdown. For reasons that become progressively clearer, Her life has reached a point of desperate crisis that has driven her into a suicidal depression. The most apparent cause of her deteriorating condition is guilt over a horrible incident she had recently set in motion. Diane is a Hollywood wannabe who fell in love with another aspiring starlet. However, after the two of them become involved with one another, at some point Diane is jilted and humiliated by this woman, so she hires a hitman to murder her estranged lover. Once the deed is done, Diane descends into a downward spiral of guilt and despair. The first 3/4 of the movie explore a dream that Diane has soon after she has learned about the death of her lover. The last quarter of the movie occurs after Diane wakes up and then explores her memories of the weeks and days leading up to the killing in the form of flashbacks. Diane's flashbacks reveal to us actual events that occurred in her life, real life, which gives them new identities in most cases, and weaves them into a fanciful and passionate conceptualization of her internal conflict. Because of the fact that the fantasy occurs before the reality segment, the two may seem distinct, but you need to see the end to understand the beginning. And yet, in many ways, the fantasy explains the reality as well. As we see the fantasy and the reality storylines played out, we come to realize that there are many complex issues involved that are quite mysterious and that are quite profoundly important to understanding the forces that shaped Diane's tragic life. In Diane's mind, there are so many conflicting emotional cross-currents that she is having trouble sorting everything out. Indeed, if we were to look into her mind and give these different cross-currents personalities of their own, it would be like entering a society full of strange and enigmatic characters battling over what to do with Diane Selwyn's life. And, in fact, that is what we do by entering the fantasy world that Diane dreams up after falling asleep in the beginning of the movie. We enter her mind at a point during which the various characters, or more precisely various personas, in her mind are trying to kill off one of the major personas who is patterned after a woman whom Diane loved in the real world. This woman has played a central role in Diane's life, and the woman's persona in Diane's mind is now seen as the source of all of Diane's problems by some of Diane's other personas. To some of these personas, Diane's life is like a movie production, because in the real world, becoming a movie star in Hollywood is very important to Diane. The persona that the others hate represents a woman that Diane had loved so deeply that her persona had been the star of this production for some time now, and the personas that attempt to assassinate her are interested in replacing her with someone else. We enter Diane's fantasy world at a point right before the assassination attempt, when the hated persona is traveling up Mulholland Drive, the fabled road that leads up a hill where important personalities in the movie business live. The hill is almost like Mount Olympus to Diane, because the people who live on that hill are like gods in the movie business, and now the hated persona is heading up there to try to become one of them. This is where the fantasy begins, and from there the plot thickens. The assassination attempt fails because of a car accident, but the hated persona is driven down the hill, injured and unable to remember anything. The other personas are now able to go on with their movie making without her, and as they begin to fight over who to recast as the next lead, some nefarious personas are still out looking for the hated one to try and finish the job. And a couple of other personas are curiously drawn to a place called Winky's, where there is some kind of monster living out in the alley behind the store. We do not learn about the nature of this beast and why it is behind Winky's until near the end of the movie. As the fantasy gets underway, it turns out that the personas in Diane's mind are about to have a visitor. Right before the real Diane Selwyn fell asleep, she was struck by an important memory that is now inserting itself into her troubled fantasy land. Her memory had to do with her younger years when she was the winner of a jitterbug contest in Deep River, Ontario. At that time in her life, she had an innocent and somewhat naive personality that is all but gone now in her current disturbed mindset. However, somewhere deep inside Diane's mind, there is the desire to bring back this innocent persona because it is seen as the key to survival for the suicidal Diane. In the real world, Diane has bought a gun and placed it in a drawer next to her bed, and she is considering using it on herself if she doesn't find a reason to live again. In contrast, the innocent persona of her past was enthusiastic about life because she was filled with a passionate dream about becoming a Hollywood movie star. And perhaps, even more importantly to the current-day Diane who feels bitter and unloved, this innocent persona of the past who was so full of hope, also felt deeply loved by Diane's dear departed aunt. Therefore, in a last-ditch effort to resolve her distresses, Diane inserts the innocent persona who feels hopeful and loved into the mess of a world that her mind has become. But will this innocence be able to survive as it comes into contact with all of the other forces at work within Diane's mind? This is a difficult question for a viewer to ask, because it is not necessarily clear to the viewer that Diane's innocent persona is even in danger until the fantasy is just about over. This is because some of the forces that threaten to destroy that innocent persona, or that innocence, I guess, cannot be completely understood until the end of the movie. But the fantasy itself plays out the question for us anyway, showing us what the result ultimately is of bringing the innocence of the past into contact with the jaded world of the present. The innocent persona of Diane is given the name Betty for reasons that, again, do not get explained until the end of the movie. It is important to note that the first thing that Betty does when she arrives in the airport, which is her doorway into this fantasy world, is separate herself from two individuals who show up with her. I believe these individuals represent her grandparents, who were there with her when she won the important jitterbug contest of the past. But she acts like she does not know them very well in this fantasy. Although they say many nice things, they seem to show a sinister side to themselves as they leave the airport laughing maniacally. Like the monster behind Winkies, we don't see them again until the end of the movie. The next thing Betty does is head straight to the former home of her aunt, which is the place where she felt so deeply loved as a child. It is from there that she wishes to make her mark on the world, and in this case, the world of the current-day Diane Selwyn's mind. However, when she gets there, she discovers the fugitive persona that the other personas have just attempted to kill. This is an unexpected turn of events for her, but it intrigues her. She does not know who this persona is, but she believes the persona has some connection to her beloved aunt, so Betty immediately begins to trust her. It turns out that the persona did see Betty's dear departed aunt as the aunt was leaving on a trip to the north, and by complimenting the aunt's red hair, the persona makes a good impression on Betty. This is a very significant point. There are many clues that later hint at the fact that the aunt's red hair made a strong impression on Diane as a child, and, as we shall see, the fugitive uses an association with the red hair to become associated with the aunt. Betty loved her aunt deeply, and in this dream the fugitive persona has been allowed to enter the aunt's home, which is like a sanctuary of love in Diane's mind. Allowing the fugitive into that sanctuary is a way of telling us early on that Diane's innocent Betty persona is connecting her love of her aunt with her feelings for the fugitive. However, the fugitive persona actually has no relationship with the aunt. In fact, the persona's fake association with the aunt is somewhat parallel to the type of fake association that the fugitive makes by taking the name of the glamorous Rita Hayworth. The fugitive pretends to be Rita Hayworth, and Rita Hayworth was a Hispanic starlet who pretended to be a redhead. The famous Rita Hayworth dyed her naturally black hair red to create a more glamorous image for herself. I believe that both the fugitive's and Rita Hayworth's pretense of a connection to the red hair is related to the fake image-making Hollywood enterprise that ultimately dupes Diane and her innocent Betty persona. But eventually, Betty does find out that this Rita persona is not who she says she is. Betty further discovers that Rita has amnesia caused by an accident she was in, and for some reason she feels that her life is in danger. Also, Rita's purse is filled with money and a blue key, which causes a fearful reaction in her. Although Betty does not know what she's getting into, she decides to help Rita. We begin to see the dynamic where Betty/Diane is drawn to Rita/Camilla almost like a moth to the flame, with no knowledge of the history involving the Rita persona that has made the other personas in Diane's mind so upset. And this means that Betty tries to embrace a version of Rita that is as innocent as is Betty herself. Furthermore, Rita's mystery gives Betty a chance to connect with her goal of becoming a star in more ways than one. She says to Rita, "It'll be just like in the movies. We'll pretend to be someone else." This statement is also one of Lynch's many hints about the nature of the events in this portion of the film, because just about all of the personas are pretending to be someone else. While Betty is protecting Rita, the other various characters are engaging in some bizarre activities. I believe all of the activities make sense when you look at the symbolism involved, but that is a discussion I only take up in my more detailed analysis below. Suffice it to say that Diane's mind is filled with many other important personas, such as certain legitimate and illegitimate Hollywood power brokers, 2 movie directors, a few actresses, a sleazy actor, a maternal apartment manager, a seedy hotel manager and club MC, a hitman, a prostitute, various pimps, a monster, a midnight cowboy, a female mystic, and a male magician, among others. Betty does not interact with most of these personas, but she does with some of them, and most of those that she does interact with like her immensely. In fact, Adam, who is one of the 2 director personas, was quite captivated by her. So much so that it is clear that he wanted to make her the star of the movie production that many of the personas are so focused on. However, he could not do this because of the intimidation and coercion he was being subjected to by some of the unsavory personas who had not met Betty. So, ultimately, Betty's goal of becoming the star persona in the world of Diane's mind gets sidetracked, and instead Betty focuses on trying to protect and redeem the Rita persona. As it turns out, this will not be easy, because she and the Rita persona discover another persona that represents the dead body of Diane Selwyn. Rita instinctively knows this is why so many of other personas are against her, and she is terrified by the implications. So, Rita decides to change her image. With the help of Betty, Rita is transformed into a doppelganger of Betty. By merging with the innocence of Betty, the Rita persona hopes to escape the fate of being eliminated from Diane's mind. Betty has always had the desire to embrace the Rita persona. Rita is like a glamorous Hollywood starlet, and Betty has always wanted to become like one of them as well. So after Rita has put on a blonde wig to make herself look like Betty, Betty tells Rita to take it off and to come into the bed with her. She wants to connect as deeply as possible to the glamorous Rita persona by making love to her. As they proceed to do just that, Betty professes to actually love Rita for real. Unfortunately, silence is Rita's only response. And it is this silence that triggers a set of realizations that begins to bring an end to both the Rita and the Betty personas in Diane's mind. The Betty persona had been brought into the world of Diane's mind because she represented a certain time when Diane felt loved by her aunt, and she embodied a zealous hope for a Hollywood career, and she personified a certain type of innocence. But all 3 of these rationales for Betty's existence are now falling apart. First off, Diane's aunt was never around when Betty was present during the entire fantasy, and so Betty never succeeded in reconnecting with her aunt's love. And since Betty was also unable to get Rita to say she loved her, just like Diane was probably unable to get Camilla to profess love for her, Diane was still stuck in an unloved state. Secondly, Betty did not succeed in getting the other personas to make Betty the star of the central movie production in her mind. Even though the other personas got rid of the first Camilla, they choose another Camilla type of persona instead of the Betty persona to be the one that they believed could be a star. Again, this was ultimately just like the real life of Diane, who had lost confidence in herself long ago, so she did not believe that a person like her could ever become a star. In fact, that is why she wanted so much to become like Camilla. And thirdly, there is a growing realization that Betty's innocence has been lost as well. There is something about Betty engaging in sexual activity to win Rita's love that brings back a horrible memory. There are hints of the issue throughout the fantasy, but the most obvious one comes up when Betty is doing an audition with a lecherous actor named Woody. In the script for the audition, Woody, an older man, plays the part of a character named Chuck. Betty is much younger than him, something that becomes clear when he wants her to do some unspoken terrible thing, and she threatens to tell her dad about it. However, apparently she has done this thing with him before, because she is disgusted with herself, saying, "I hate you. I hate us both." And whatever she did with this man named Chuck, the fact that the man was her father's, quote, best friend, just makes it even worse. The clear implication is that she was involved sexually with Chuck at a very young age, and this represented clear sexual abuse because the script says Chuck would have been arrested if Betty had told anyone. We don't know much about Chuck other than the fact that he wasn't the father, although he was a man who was very close to the father. Later, when we see the grandmother and grandfather appear as demons who chase Diane into her bedroom, tormenting her until she commits suicide, we can deduce that Chuck may well have been the grandfather, with the grandmother siding with him in order to cover it up. Thus, the images in the beginning of the film that show the grandmother and grandfather characters being loving and supportive in the jitterbug scene, and in the airport scenes, may have been misleading. Since Diane distances herself quickly from these figures and never revisits them after Betty arrives in the fantasy, their relationship to her was ambiguous at best. And their bizarre laughter as they left the airport without Betty hints at a more sinister reality in their relationship with Diane. And this means that the Betty persona's innocence was just an oversimplification of her traumatic history. And Diane's attempt to repress the reality of the past trauma, although understandable, was a complete failure. Betty and Rita come to realize these awful truths during the Club Silencio scene. A magician who performs at the Club Silencio tells them in many different ways that what they experienced during the fantasy wasn't real, it was all an illusion. The chance to reconnect with Aunt Ruth, the chance to become a star, and the idea that Betty had not already lost her innocence were all false truths. Aunt Ruth's name may even be an indication of this, because if you just remove the first letter, it becomes untruth. At the end of the magician's performance, he emphatically tells us to listen. Then, as flashes of lightning and peals of thunder fill the theater, Betty's body gets tense and starts shaking uncontrollably. While she does this, the magician's face looks like he is straining, and he is somewhat tense as well. And then, suddenly, there is the sound of a man making a grunting sound, like he is releasing something pent up inside of him. Then the magician relaxes with an evil grin on his face, as Betty also relaxes finally, looking unsure of what just happened. Next, in a cloud of smoke, the magician vanishes. I believe that this last revelation from the magician was sexual in nature. The magician was forcing Diane to relive how her Betty-like innocence was lost long ago when she had been raped as a child. All that's left now is the tears, and so Rebecca Del Rio comes out to sing the Spanish version of a song called Crying, written by Roy Orbison. Before singing the song, Rebecca Del Rio was introduced in Spanish as the Crying Lady of Los Angeles. This title is also the name of a legendary Spanish woman who was jilted by her husband who left her with their 2 children for another woman. Overwhelmed by the loss of her lover, she kills herself, or her 2 children, and then herself. In a certain sense, this is a hint that Diane's grief in the real world has made her homicidal as well as suicidal. And later we find out that Diane is in fact responsible for a homicide. So even before her song is done, Rebecca Del Rio collapses, probably in death, as if to emphasize to Diane that death is all around, and all hope is lost. With all of this information, Betty and Rita discover that Betty now has a blue box in her purse that they assume the blue key in Rita's purse will open. So the two of them rush back to the aunt's apartment where Rita's purse is located so that they can get the key and open the box. But when the key and the box are in the same room together, Betty disappears before the two of them can even open the box. It appears that Diane's mind experiences an extreme feeling of guilt when the key and the box are in the same room. The guilt involved forces her to abandon any more pretense of innocence, and since Betty is that pretense, she cannot remain any longer, and so she vanishes. The guilt I'm referring to here is the guilt that causes Rebecca Del Rio to collapse while being associated with the crying lady who killed her two children. It is the guilt that Diane probably had in real life when she found the blue key that signified that the hitman had killed Camilla. Just by finding that key, Diane was forced to confront her guilt. We saw the same kind of collapse that Rebecca Del Rio experienced when a character known as Dan faced the beast behind the Winkies. Dan was a character from Diane's real life who looked at her at the same time that the hitman showed her the key for the first time. Thus, the Dan persona's relationship to Diane involved the key in her mind, and this is the primary reason he is in her fantasy. So, since Dan was afraid of finding something behind the Winkies, then the key that the hitman left for Diane was most likely found behind the Winkies. It killed off Dan when he went back there to face it. In a way analogous to the fact that the Betty persona cannot face the moment that the key and the box are finally present together. Together they represent the knowledge of the horrible act that has condemned Diane to a guilt-ridden existence. However, the Rita persona did not represent innocence, so Rita does not disappear initially like Betty. But Rita does represent Camilla, the person that Diane paid a hitman to have killed. The blue key was the secret token that would be left for Diane to find, probably behind the Winkies, when the deed was done. This means that the secret inside the blue box that is opened by the blue key involves the realization that Camilla is no more. This follows because the box represents the truth that is opened up by the key, and the key revealed Camilla's death to Diane. So when Rita opens up the box and sees nothingness, she seems to be sucked into it. Then when the box falls to the ground, we see that it is still empty. Thus, Rita follows Camilla's fate as she is finally eliminated. The box has taken her out of the picture of the fantasy world in Diane's open mind. Needless to say, Diane's fantasy failed to resolve the issues with which she was struggling. She wakes up, interacts irritably with her neighbor, sees the key, and then begins to have flashbacks showing what led up to her current deteriorating state. By and large, these flashbacks involve the cruel breakup of her relationship with Camilla, and the fact that she went to have a hitman have Camilla killed in the aftermath of the breakup. Once the flashbacks have ended, she imagines that her grandparents are demons now, released from the box in her fantasy, the blue box, in her fantasy, and that they have now come to get her. They chase her to the bedroom while she is screaming hysterically. After they have caused her to fall down onto the bed, she pulls a gun from the dresser drawer and shoots herself in the head. As she is dying, we see the monster's face again, the one that was behind the Winkies. It fades into her face because the monster was a part of her, representing a twisted persona that drove her to do something for which she could never forgive herself. Next, as she is dying, she also sees the Betty and Rita personas, and the Rita persona has on the blonde wig. It is as though the two personas have finally successfully merged, and they are truly happy at last. A merger of the past innocent persona that Diane desperately wanted to hold on to with the passionate starlet persona she had always wanted to become. Ending her own life seems to have been a type of retribution for the murder, since she is now free of the guilt and finally able to embrace both the Betty and Rita personas in her dying moments. The final scene we see is at Club Silencio, and a blue-haired lady is there who we also saw in the earlier Club Silencio scene. She has the final word, silencio, which simply means silence in Spanish. Whereas before the idea of silence involved the notion that there was only the Hollywood pretense of stardom, love and innocence for Diane when none of it was real, now the idea of silence seems to instead involve the concept that nothing more can be said. Here, at the end of the movie, I believe that Lynch pays homage to Shakespeare, as we are reminded of Hamlet's dying words to Horatio, "The rest is silence." Alright guys, now we're on to part 2, which is background and motivation. And I was looking, and I think I will do 3 of these, and next time I'll do the symbolism and metaphor and just 10 clues, and after that I think I'll do a couple separate videos for the scene by scene analysis, because that's going to take a very long time to read. But yeah, I just thought I'd throw that out there. So part 2, background and motivation. However, as it turns out, there is still much more that can be said about Lynch's movie. In fact, the above interpretation is just scratching the surface of some of the movie's thematic content, its enigmatic characterizations, its intricately threaded, multi-layered storyline, and its complex symbolism and rich texture. And this is quite remarkable because in some ways the film Mulholland Drive was really a fortuitous accident. It was originally intended to be a TV series like Lynch's Twin Peaks before it, and in some sense the accident that produced Mulholland Drive was eerily similar to the accident in one of the opening sequences of the film, where a beautiful vehicle with a beautiful passenger is in a terrible crash during an assassination attempt. Mulholland Drive is the cinematic vehicle that would not die even after the terrible accident it suffered along with other attempts to kill the project. The majority of the movie was filmed as a pilot for the proposed TV series, and as such it was structured to open up storylines that would take an entire season, and perhaps multiple seasons, to resolve. Not many filmmakers would intentionally embed so many subplots and complex thematic devices in a work they believed viewers would only have the limited amount of time to engage that we get in the movie theaters. Thus, as I said, it was an accident that brought this movie into being, because before Lynch knew what form the final cinematic vehicle would take, he certainly did pile into the film complexities and plot devices galore. Inevitably, Lynch had to wrestle with the question of how he was going to transform his vision for a TV series into a concept suitable for a movie of only 2 hours and 20 minutes. How would he resolve all of the many loose ends he created without having the time to develop their initial threads in the manner that he had originally intended? His most uncharitable critics will tell you that he just decided not to resolve everything, but in my opinion, they are wrong. Instead, he decided to trust the artistry of his craft and the power of his medium to allow the resolutions to come from the subtext of the story, communicated through a rich language of metaphor and symbolism. Such a decision also required Lynch to have a good deal of trust in his audience as well, since now his work would become more difficult to interpret. I think this trust was well placed, because I believe that those that give it a chance often find the film to be no less gratifying than an extremely challenging but richly rewarding novel. Just taking a quick pause here, I just want to say I completely agree. The first time I watched this movie, it was like watching a dream, which obviously you are, but I mean, you know, the way Lynch is with his stuff, it was a beautiful dream and a terrible nightmare all at once. I think that's how it's described by many. And you know, I didn't understand it at all, and the second time I watched it, I understood it better. But you know, there was like he's saying, you know, the language of the subtext and the context and the themes and the symbolism. There's just so much to dissect, and every time I learn more about, how his symbolism works and how the specific things like the subtext and stuff specific to this movie work. I mean, it's no joke. It really is gratifying. I couldn't recommend it more. Sorry, carrying on. I was one of Lynch's many viewers who accepted the challenge to sift through his movie carefully. In many ways, Lynch's film is an expression of issues that have a very long history within his works. Like the works of many other unconventional filmmakers, Lynch's films deal in themes that force us to examine our assumptions about entertainment and our habit of viewing films as just another form of entertainment. Are we in the theater to escape from our problems, or are we there to examine other lives on display so that we may reinterpret our own? Can we say that we are not putting ourselves into the position of the protagonist when we watch a film, especially if that film deeply explores issues from the point of view of the protagonist? And if we admit to some degree that we do in fact see through the protagonist's eyes, then to what extent does this help us resolve our own conflicts, and to what extent does it simply confuse us all the more? It is a question that concerns playing out one's issues within the context of a different persona. This is not just about walking in someone else's shoes, but it is about living within someone else's head and seeing through his or her eyes. Persona, the groundbreaking film by Ingmar Bergman, I hope I said that right, is one of the most regarded classic films to seriously address this question using profound symbolism and cinematic techniques that are still innovative almost 40 years later. A more contemporary film that approaches this question using instead lighthearted literalism and shrewd humor is Being John Malkovich, directed by Spike Jonze and written by Charlie Kaufman. But Lynch takes the issue farther than Bergman, Jones, or Kaufman. Throwing caution to the wind, Lynch asks us, what would happen if we were not just in one head at a time? What would happen if our complex motivations and conflicted hearts were represented by a cast of personas in conflict with one another, and all struggling for control over the direction that our life will take? If you're willing to think of the main character in Mulholland Drive in this light, and envision her fantasy as a journey to determine the ultimate fate she will face after the fantasy is over, then you begin to understand the enormous trust Lynch puts in his audience. He wants us to take the journey with her, seeing her life through the eyes of multiple personas, and in doing so, Lynch wants us to learn to love her and to be angry with her, to be impressed and unimpressed, to be filled with hope and to be filled with dread. In essence, he wants us to engage in her conflict with her and to come away without any easy answers. And in the end, he wants us to learn some very heart-wrenching lessons. But I'm jumping ahead without having laid a proper foundation. I think a deeper exploration of the background to the film is in order. A Lament for Fallen Angels. In my opinion, it is important to view this film as an ode to those young women whose lives are destroyed during their pursuit of a Hollywood career. In fact, the film is explicitly dedicated to one such woman named Jennifer Syme. I hope I'm saying that right. It's spelled S-Y-M-E. If I'm sounding like an idiot, please tell me. Who had previously worked with David Lynch on some of his films. She was 29 when she was killed in a tragic car accident at the same year the movie came out. Interestingly enough, I believe that the film is covertly dedicated to another young woman who also aspired to make it in Hollywood. That woman died at the age of 22, at about a week from the day 1 year after David Lynch was born. The woman's name was Elizabeth Short, although she was nicknamed Black Dahlia because of her arresting beauty and her stylish black hair. The real Elizabeth Short was called Betty by some, as a shortened version of her name. I believe this is one of the many possible allusions which explains why there is a major character named Betty in Mulholland Drive. Lynch has had a long-standing interest in the life of Elizabeth Short, and it is even rumored that he owns the movie rights to a story about Black Dahlia's murder written by John Gilmore. Betty, who is also Diane in Mulholland Drive, is not the only one with something in common with Black Dahlia. Rita, who is also Camilla in the movie, is also a very beautiful woman with an impressive mane of long black hair. Not only that, but like Black Dahlia, the second character's life will also end with a murder. But Betty and Rita are only associated with the Black Dahlia and the background motivation of Lynch. The connection between them is not very explicit. However, I think it is important to note that both of the female protagonists in the movie were actresses whose lives became associated with a woman who was destined to die following her dream to become a Hollywood actress. Indeed, even though both of the protagonists' circumstances are different from that of Black Dahlia, they will both follow her into her ultimate fate. In fact, if you step back and look at the essential arc of the movie, in the beginning, the main character, Betty/Diane, arrives in Hollywood full of zeal and passion, but by the end she is a broken woman, whose life energy has been beaten out of her. The opening jitterbug dance sequence, among other things, offers us a metaphor for her bubbly, energetic persona at the beginning, while a group of dirty dishes falling and breaking near the end symbolize her final fallen, broken, and unclean state. I believe that Lynch is driving home the message that the Hollywood dream is an extremely dangerous dream. But more subtly, Lynch is also dissecting for us the inner dynamics of the fall that the main character experienced. What I think many miss when watching the movie is the nature of the inner conflict that pursuing the Hollywood dream establishes in both the heart and the mind of those who are not especially guarded and careful. While many see the movie as a condemnation of the potentially sinister nature of the impersonal and corrupt Hollywood machinery, I believe the movie is more of a poignant exposé of internalized forces that work to overcome and destroy those who are attracted to the blue neon glow of Hollywood's glamour. It is not the movie-making enterprise that Lynch targets. Okay, sorry, scratch that. Rather, it is not the movie-making enterprise that Lynch targets, for he himself is an accomplished devotee who gives honor to those in his craft in spite of his critiques. But Lynch does shine a penetrating light on the flawed human element within that enterprise, which is prone to believe too deeply in its own fanciful artifice, and by so doing, lose touch with the more meaningful relationships that are disconnected from the business. One architect of LA's conspicuous consumption. A case in point is William Mulholland, the man who was honored by having a major street in Los Angeles named after him. What did he do to deserve the honor of becoming the namesake for Mulholland Drive? He was an Irish immigrant with minimal formal education who taught himself the craft of engineering and then rose to the top to become the superintendent and chief engineer of the Los Angeles Water Department. In that position, he oversaw the construction of the 233-mile Los Angeles Aqueduct, which was finished in 1913 ahead of time and under budget. The aqueduct brought much needed water from the Owens River into Los Angeles. The water was critical to the city's dreams for the exceptional growth and glory that it enjoys today. Yet deceit and corruption were involved to take away water rights from Owens Valley farmers and other residents who had different plans for the river. Mulholland's financial backers became rich off the water bonanza, while members of the Owens Valley suffered complete financial ruin. Some called it the Rape of Owens Valley. At the opening ceremony for the aqueduct, Mulholland uttered his most enduring quote, "There it is. Take it." I believe a form of this quote echoes repeatedly throughout Lynch's movie as the character after character repeats Diane's infamous words, "This is the girl." Each time those words are uttered, the context is such that the character might as well continue on and say, "Take her," since, like William Mulholland, they appear to be delivering a type of commodity who is being given over for some type of momentous consumption. However, when the commodities are human beings, they do not always survive the consumption. William Mulholland's commodity trafficking only involved water, but even his star ultimately failed to survive. Tragedy struck as Mulholland sought to bring into the city more and more water. The St. Francis Dam was one of the dams he had built for this purpose, but it collapsed in 1928, killing almost 500 people in the resulting flood. He resigned under criticism that he had filled the reservoir too quickly and that he had not sought after any independent expert opinion during the entire project. In essence, the claim was that he had gotten too cocky and his own hubris had brought him down. Whether or not Mulholland was at fault for the collapse is still under dispute, but he took full responsibility, saying, "If there is an error of human judgment, I am the human." Like Mulholland, we are all only human, and Lynch makes us take a very intimate look at how human judgment is prone to flaws and errors, and especially when it comes to engaging in the dream and the legend that is Hollywood. City of Dreams and Nightmares. Lynch's movie is replete with images of the legendary Hollywood. There is the cowboy who looks like he's from the Roy Rogers era. There are the musical numbers that seem like they could have come from the 50s and 60s. Then there is the true veteran starlet from the musicals of the 40s, Ann Miller. And many other symbols of nostalgia stand out, like the poster of Rita Hayworth, the vintage car from the mid-40s, the frequent references to Sunset Boulevard, and the jitterbug dance sequences that had that 60s psychedelic feel to them. Even the scenes with the mobsters felt retro with their colorful big-screen atmosphere that is somewhat distinct from the mobster images that are still very contemporary on TV. But perhaps most significant to Lynch in terms of establishing that mythological Hollywood ambiance was the place where the Betty and Rita characters lived during the first 3/4 of the movie. Lynch's screenplay describes this place as, quote, "an ancient, gorgeous courtyard apartment building built during the golden age of cinema." Yet, was that age really all that golden in Lynch's view? Not if you take seriously the symbolic importance of the dog excrement left in the middle of the courtyard of this apartment complex. Oh, geez, I'm sorry, I lost my place. Right. And not if you take seriously the name of the street on which this complex is found, Havenhurst. It does not take any leap to figure out that Lynch wants us to be somewhat balanced in our thinking about legendary Hollywood. It may have been a haven for some like Rita Hayworth, but it was a hearse for others like Elizabeth Short. Alright, we're on to our third section, and this is the Diane Selwyn story. And I can see this is getting pretty long, so I'm probably going to read this one and wrap it up. I'm not sure. I'm just going to say this now since I've already interrupted myself. I don't know when I'll upload the next part, but I'll try to make it soon so that, if you're watching this video whenever it's actually relevant to you, that maybe the rest of it will be up soon after. But yeah, I just want to get that out of the way, because whenever I finish reading this section, I'll probably just kind of stop it without saying anything else. Alright. With this as a backdrop, I can begin to outline what I believe to be Diane Selwyn's chronological storyline in Mulholland Drive, as revealed with complex plot devices and veiled imagery throughout the movie. Both the mother and father of Diane Selwyn died when she was very young. Sorry if you could hear that car. When she was very young, so she went to live with her grandparents. Tragically, at some point during her childhood, she was sexually abused by her grandfather. Diane's grandmother eventually found out about the abuse, and she made Diane the scapegoat and told her to never speak of it again. The damage this did to Diane was enormous. From that point on, Diane always believed there was something wrong with her. However, she had an aunt named Ruth who still believed in her. Her aunt lived in Los Angeles, where she had a successful career working in the movie business. Her aunt became an inspiration to her, giving her hope that she could one day escape her circumstances and make it in the same world in which her aunt lived. And because her aunt knew that she had this goal, her aunt set aside money in her will for Diane that would go to help Diane pursue her dream. Although Diane tried to repress the memory of the abuse, her relationship with her grandparents was never recovered, and Diane did not feel loved by them. But when she got older, something happened that helped her produce a new and more pleasant dimension to their difficult relationship. When Diane was a young adult, she won a jitterbug contest in Canada. Her grandparents were very happy about this, and they seemed to suddenly believe in her again. It was as though she could win their love back as long as she was a star. They even encouraged her to pursue her dream to go to Hollywood. And then her aunt died, and Diane flew to Los Angeles with the money she received from the will. Her aunt had worked as a casting agent, but Diane wanted to be an actress. Her childhood had been so horrible that she fell in love with the idea of being able to become someone else during a film. This led her to decide that in principle, her focus was on becoming a great actress instead of a star. But deep down, she also hoped that stardom would follow, because that was what held the secret to making people love her. However, as an unknown, all alone in Hollywood, she had trouble getting any acting roles, big or small. After a period of time, Diane was becoming a very discouraged person, and her aunt's money was beginning to run out. So she moved into room number 16 at the Park Hotel. It was a cheap hotel in a rundown area of Los Angeles. She also got a job as a waitress at a Winkies diner. But the money from Winkies was not enough, even though where she was living was not very expensive. When she could no longer afford to pay the rent, Cookie, the manager of the hotel, visited her one night and let her know that she was going to have to pay him somehow. She became desperate, and someone told her that she could make some fast money by joining a call girl operation. One thing led to another, and Diane agreed to be placed in the pimp's black book. She gave in because her previous abuse as a child made her feel like there was something inevitable about being treated like a sexual commodity. Her self-esteem was devastated by this turn of events in her life. She began a habit of smoking when she was going out with her Johns. Yet her bills were finally being paid. Eventually, she quit working at Winkies and moved out of the Park Hotel into a nicer place at 2590 Sierra Bonita, apartment number 12. Even while she remained in the call girl business, Diane continued to pursue her dream of becoming an actress. And finally, it seemed like she might get her wish. Someone named Wally Brown, who was an old friend of her aunt's, agreed to let her try out for the lead part in a movie he was having made. The movie was called The Sylvia North Story, and it was not a major production, so lesser-known actresses were being given an opportunity to audition for the lead. The film was about a young woman who had suffered through sexual abuse in her childhood. Getting the part meant everything to Diane since it had a connection to her own life story. And of course, finally becoming an actress would give her some deeply needed validation, and it might even free her from the dependence on the call girl business. Sadly, the director of the movie, Bob Brooker, was not impressed with her, so she did not get the part. The woman who got the part was named Camilla Rhodes, and she won the audition by playing the role more seductively than Diane. Diane was impressed with Camilla's ability to heat up what she thought was such a lame scene. With a glow of admiration in her eyes, Diane told this to Camilla, and the two became good friends. Even though Camilla had gotten the part, it was a low-budget movie and Camilla was still struggling financially. So Diane and Camilla decided to become roommates to share their living expenses. At some point, while living together, they went from being friends to becoming lovers. For Diane, who had only had extremely bad relationships with men, Camilla became a fixation. She loved Camilla deeply, and, to some extent because of her low self-esteem, she began to want to become like Camilla. Camilla got good reviews for her sexy portrayal in the Sylvia North Story, and was eventually offered starring roles in other low-budget movies. Unlike Diane's career, Camilla's career was actually moving forward, and although she did not love Diane, she thought of Diane as her #1 fan and enjoyed living with her. However, Diane's fixation was growing into an obsession. Because of their relationship, Diane asked Camilla if she could try and get her roles in some of Camilla's movies. Camilla said she was willing to do this, but there was a catch. Diane would have to sleep with some of the movie executives. After all, Camila reasoned, Diane was a call girl, and even Camila was willing to do this once in a while. In this way, Camila revealed that she was an opportunist, and she became like a pimp to Diane, arranging for her to sleep with important men in order to promote Diane's career in small ways, while in more serious ways also promoting Camila's career. Although unhappy about this, Diane would do anything to be in a movie, and she would also do anything for Camila. Diane continued to profess her love for Camila, but Camila never reciprocated. This arrangement went on for more than one movie. Then Camila finally got a lead role in a more mainstream film being directed by Adam Kesher. Because it was a mainstream movie, Camila finally had enough money to pay for her own place. So she moves out of Diane's apartment, although Camila does not officially break up with Diane yet. However, Diane is still devastated, and she begins to get very depressed about being alone in apartment number 12. At some point, Diane begins to see a psychiatrist because of her depression. Since Diane is so depressed in number 12, the psychiatrist hoped that maybe moving to another apartment would help. Diane had a friend who was a neighbor named L.J. DeRosa, who was living in apartment number 17. DeRosa had witnessed how depressed Diane had become after Camila moved out, and so when Diane asked DeRosa if she would be willing to switch apartments with her, DeRosa agreed to do so out of compassion. However, DeRosa was not entirely happy with the apartment switch, because she saw that Diane was still in a relationship with Camila, and she thought that was really the cause of Diane's problems. Camila was still actively pimping Diane, and she got Diane yet another small part in the film Adam was directing by having her sleep with an executive named Luigi Castigliani. Adam had recently gone through a difficult divorce, and he and Camila hit it off. Moreover, Camila and Adam began seeing each other, even while Camila and Diane were still in a relationship. At times, Adam and Camila would show affection for each other, even on the movie set. Diane could not help but feel jealous about this, and she was hopeful that her relationship with Camila would survive. After all, Camila had stayed with her for a long time, even though they both had been involved sexually with her men during that time. However, this logic did not turn out to be sound. Camila began giving Diane hints that she was ready to break up with her. And then one day when Camila was visiting Diane at apartment number 17, while the two of them were making love, Camila told Diane that they must end their relationship. Diane got upset and then tried to force herself on Camila. That just made things worse, and Camila became more insistent that it was really over. Diane got hysterical and then threw Camila out. Soon after the breakup, Camila tried to repair the friendship for reasons that were not entirely clear to Diane. Camila invited Diane to come to a dinner party at Adam's house, and she told her that Luigi was going to be there. Diane wondered if this was just more of Camila's same old stuff, pimping her to the movie execs. Yet Diane was still in love with Camila, and she could not help but want to see her again, even though she was afraid of how she would feel when she saw Camila with Adam. Diane's fears made her very hesitant, so even though she said she was coming to the party, when a limousine came to take her to the party, she could not get herself to go to the car. After a while, Camila called her and once again convinced her to come. As we learn later, Camila planned to use the party to announce her engagement to Adam, one of the big shots in Hollywood, and she wanted people like Diane there who were in her circle of devotees so they could see her latest moment of glory. Camila probably also wanted her devotees there, so they would talk positively about her to the other big shots at the party, since Camila was always focused on using others to promote herself. In fact, Camila was so interested in having someone like Diane there, she still thought of her as her #1 fan, that Camila waited outside to escort Diane to the party herself. She wanted to surprise Diane, so she waited behind a tree, a little bit down the hill on the road that leads up to Adam's house. She had arranged for the limousine that was taking Diane up to the party to stop there, and let Camila walk Diane the rest of the way up through a secret pathway. When the limousine stopped on an empty stretch of road on Mulholland Drive, Diane was initially afraid, When she saw Camila come to her from behind a tree, she was intrigued. All of the drama only served to make Diane begin to believe that maybe Camila was interested in reconciling with her after all. Diane did not know about Camila's surprise announcement for later that night, and so she went into the party wearing her heart on her sleeve, desperately hoping that she and Camila would soon be back together. Camila and Adam were extremely affectionate toward one another at the party, and Diane became increasingly uncomfortable. Then Diane saw Luigi, who noticed her as well. Luigi stared at her, clearly thinking about getting together with her again. And then, unexpectedly, a woman that looked somewhat like Diane walked over to Camila and kissed her on the lips. And worse yet, Camila kissed her back passionately. Up until that moment, Diane had been able to hope that even if Camila stayed with Adam, it was possible that Camila could still have an intimate relationship with her. Camila's kiss with this other woman showed Diane that Camila was not coming back to her. Camila had replaced Diane with this new woman in her life. Diane was stunned. And then Camila and Adam announced their engagement while giggling and laughing. Now Diane was completely devastated. In her heart, Diane feels that she never should have come. She should never have picked up the phone when Camila called earlier that night. But she did, and now she is unable to cope with her feelings for Camila any longer. At that moment, Diane's love for Camila turned into hatred. Soon after the party, Diane contacted a hitman. She arranged to meet him at the nearby Winkies. She brought him a picture of Camila and thousands of dollars for the payoff. Apparently she was able to save the money while working as a call girl. The hitman told her that when the deed was done, he would leave a blue key for her somewhere in an alley behind the diner, since this is where the contract on Camila's life was arranged. Diane's anger had driven her to this, and her mind was becoming unstable. She kept getting fixated on different things that she saw at the diner, from the hitman, to the money, to the blue key, to the name tag of the waitress who served them. She even gets fixated on the face of a man who appeared to be a customer at the cash register. He just happens to look in her direction after she stares at him as she was shown the blue key. Sometime later, Diane found the blue key behind Winky's in its appointed place, and she brought the key home and placed it on the coffee table. Camila was dead. Grief overcame Diane, and she went into the deepest depression she had ever experienced. She began sitting or sleeping in her apartment for extended periods without answering the phone or the door. At some point, she is told that 2 detectives wanted to question her, so she became extremely afraid. Overwhelmed by both grief and fear, and becoming suicidal, Diane takes some type of a drug while in her bedroom, and then fell into a deep sleep. While asleep, she entered into a remarkable fantasy that revealed how her mind was trying to cope with everything that had happened. Unfortunately, the fantasy ultimately failed to help her deal with her misery, and she woke up no better off than when she went to sleep. As the fantasy comes to an end, she was awakened by the sound of someone knocking loudly on her door. This time she opened it and found that it was her neighbor DeRosa, who had come to pick up the rest of her things that were left there after they had switched apartments. When DeRosa saw her piano ashtray on Diane's coffee table, she picked it up, returning Diane's thoughts back to the blue key that was also on the coffee table. When DeRosa leaves, Diane can do nothing but think of Camila. She begins remembering the passion and excitement that Camila brought to her life, and she started to experience flashbacks of the events that led up to those last fateful days. It had only been 3 weeks since she moved into apartment number 17, and now Camila was dead, and everything seemed more messed up and tragic than before. Camila was gone forever, and Diane had gone simply from having a poor self-image to now completely despising herself. She felt that she did not have any reason to live anymore. At some point, Diane again hears someone knocking at the door, very forcefully this time. She imagines that it is her grandparents, who are the ones who started all of her troubles in the first place, coming now as demons to haunt her. She hears someone she imagines to be Camila screaming in horror. She gets terrified, and the demons begin chasing her. They are chasing her to the bedroom, the place where her childhood abuse took place. Screaming as she's completely losing her mind, Diane takes a gun out of her dresser drawer and finally kills herself.